Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan. We are back with the Federalist, lecture number 4, The Problem of Majority Faction.
In the previous lecture, The Extended Republic, we were introduced to Publius's proposals for improvements to the science of politics. One of them is in direct response to a criticism the Anti-Federalists had of the large size of the American Republic. This thing stretches from Maine all the way down to Georgia. Anti-Federalists said, a republic requires you to know your neighbors. This republic is too big. People in Georgia and Maine can't really know each other in a meaningful way. And Publius responds with, the extended republic actually solves a major problem of free government, that of faction.
And where the argument is made is in Federalist number 10, which is one of the most famous papers published by Publius. Federalist 10 goes into the problem of majority faction or minority faction in general. And what is interesting here is that it's one of the glimpses that we get into their understanding of human nature and why it is important when considering the form of a government. You cannot ignore the way people behave, the way people are, what their nature is, and you have to account for it.
Dr. Pestritto explains this in the lecture, but what is a faction?
Yeah, a faction, let me actually get the right definition. It is either a majority or a minority who are united by a common political aim that is harmful to the rights of other citizens or the common good of a society.
So a faction isn't just a group of citizens banded together. It's a group of citizens banded together for a purpose that will harm others and, by inference, will harm themselves because they're harming their nation. And Publius explains if you have a really big country, it's hard for any group of bad actors to gain enough control to shape the course of the country. It's a pretty elegant and beautiful argument, relatively simple. And Dr. Pestritto lays it out very well in this lecture.
And he points out that this is the first time, this is the thing that makes the political science of our founders unique. Representative government existed before. An independent judiciary, there was a form of it before. There were all the forms of government. They perfected it, but this is the one that is unique and new for the American founding.
If you're enjoying this course, we could use your help. We don't charge for the courses on the website. We don't charge for the podcast. We do that because we want to make learning available for all who wish to learn, but it does cost us money to make these things. If you have benefited from these courses and you would like to help us by supporting us, help us to make more of these courses, please go to hillsdale.edu/course. That's hillsdale.edu/course to make a tax-deductible donation to Hillsdale College.
Now let's turn to Lecture 4 of the Federalist, The Problem of Majority Faction.
In our previous session, focusing mostly on Federalist number 9, we talked about the initial attempts in states to form their constitutions and how they did a very good job at throwing off executive tyranny and establishing legislative supremacy, but how that was not really the only goal, or shouldn't be the only goal, of establishing a republic. We want to preserve, Publius had said in that paper, the excellencies of Republican government, that is to say, its consent, its basis in the people. But we need to do something about the imperfections. We need to lessen or avoid them altogether. And that's what the improvements in the Constitution are designed to do. Well, Publius picks up on this theme in the 10th Federalist paper, one of the most well-known Federalist papers, and it's worth going through the text of that paper with some care. The first thing that Publius does in the 10th Federalist Papers is to describe the situation as many concerned partisans of liberty see it, given the situation in state government in the 1780s. Publius writes the following. He says, "Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority." Also in our last session, we would explain that part of the problem at the heart of this issue is the problem of majority faction. That when we establish a system where the majority rules, sometimes that majority can rule for the sake of the rights of all, for the common good, but other times that majority will seek to rule for the sake of its own narrow part, for its own self-interest, for its own good, at the expense of the rights of others in the community, at the expense of the common good. And Publius's republicanism is an attempt to address itself to that problem. And Federalist 10 is all about that problem. It's the problem of what Publius calls majority faction. We should start here with a definition that Publius gives us of what a faction is. He writes, "By a faction I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community." So there are a couple important pieces of that definition to note. First of all, a faction can be made up of a majority or a minority of the society, and there are different ways of dealing with the problem depending upon which of those things we're facing. But the key there to understanding what a faction is that it's driven by passion, is driven by a basic understanding of human nature that Publius has. And it really comes out in this paper. For Publius, the human being is a mix of two basic elements, his passion and his reason. Reason is the thing that distinguishes us from the beasts. And the passions in government are the things that sometimes can get the better of the human being and lead them to make self-interested decisions that are inconsistent with the common good. And so the key thing about faction here is passion. It's when a group is motivated by passion, by a regard for its own sake, its own piece of the pie, and not for the good, not for the rights of all citizens. So it's important to understand that a faction isn't just any group in society that tries to get something done through political means. And often this is misunderstood. There are plenty of group efforts to accomplish policy aims in politics that aren't factious. They're aimed at the common good, they're driven by a certain view of the common good. So not every majority or every minority that tries to maneuver in our national politics, not every interest group, let's say, to use today's terminology, is a factious interest group. Here, Madison's being very specific. It's when the motivation is for governance for the sake of a particular part. So in number 10, Publius lays out not only the basic purpose of the paper, but really the basic purpose of the Constitution, of the whole convention. He says, we're trying to have a republic. We're trying to give the people the means to consent to the way they're governed. But we're trying to do it in a way that has regard for the equal rights of all, that has regard for justice. And the way Publius sums this up is to say, to secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and the form of popular government, is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. So we want to preserve consent, but within the boundaries of a system that secures the equal rights of all. And that's tough to do. That's why the system that they are describing here isn't simply a pure democracy. So what do we do about this problem of faction? We want to preserve majority rule, after all. It's better than the alternative. So how do we tackle it? Well, Publius begins by saying there are really two ways. We can either stop it from existing altogether. We can prevent it from arising. That's one possibility. Or, acknowledging that it's going to arise, acknowledging that it's going to exist, we can deal with its effects and try to mitigate or control its effects. And Federalist 10 is a very orderly paper, and he's just going to go through and consider both of those options. Publius is going to consider what he thinks are the two ways that we could stop faction from arising altogether. Right? So we wouldn't even have to deal with the problem. He says, are one, by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence, And he says the other is by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. All right, so let's consider each of those. Method number one, we can eliminate the problem of faction if we eliminate the liberty that people have to do factious things. If we restrict their freedom of operation in society, if we prevent them from engaging in politics and from participating in the political process, if we prevent them from expressing their opinions and deny them other liberties, we can take care of the faction problem pretty easily that way. It really won't matter what they think or what they want to do. Publius puts this under the category of this is something that is doable but undesirable. The way he puts it exactly in number 10 is to say it could never be more truly said than of the first remedy that it is worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an aliment without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less a folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life. So, yes, we could do that, but I'm thinking most people here probably want to avoid that solution. So what's the other thing we could do? He says, well, you could give to everybody the same interests and opinions. In other words, you can make everybody the same. If by faction we mean one part rules for its own sake toward the harm of another part, well, if you don't have different parts, if there's just one whole, then by definition you don't have a faction problem. Well, what about that possibility? Now, the way Publius puts it is, this thing you simply cannot do. The destroy liberty option, option number one, you could do it, but it would be undesirable. This isn't even an option. This isn't even possible. And why isn't it possible? Why can't you make everybody the same? Why can't you give to everybody the same opinions, interests, and so on? It's contrary to our nature. We are not wired like that. And any ordinary reflection you might make on yourselves and your friends and your family members, people you know that human beings don't operate that way. And so this leads Publius to a conclusion where he says, the latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man. That's a very well-known statement from number 10. The latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man. We're always going to have faction.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Now, if you consider these two alternatives that he had given us to eliminate faction, they are basically the playbook that has been run by some of the totalitarian regimes that we're familiar with in recent history. You eliminate liberty, right? You suppress the liberty of your citizens, and you have some kind of utopian education scheme where you force them all or try to force them all to think the same things. That is why Madison in this paper says, yeah, that's not going to be a route we can go. Neither of these options are going to work. Having understood why we cannot stop faction from happening, we have to turn to the other possibility. It's going to happen. What can we do about it? How do we make it less dangerous? How do we mitigate it? How do we control its effects? Well, the first thing to think about when we talk about controlling the effects of faction is what kind of faction are we dealing with? Remember, he said factions can either be majority or minority. So let's deal with the problem of minority faction. You have a group of people who constitute less than 50%, and they want to use the political institutions to benefit their own part at the expense of others. And Publius's answer to this is do nothing. It's not a problem. As he puts it, the Republican principle supplies the remedy. Well, what's the Republican principle? The Republican principle is the majority rules. So if this is a minority faction, then just outvote them. Problem solved. The form of government doesn't create any problem here. But just in the way that the form of government comes to our rescue with minority factions, it fuels the flames of the fire in the case of a majority faction. We're in a majority rule system. That's the way that a majority faction can do its damage. So what do we do about this great problem of majority faction? About the possibility that we set up this nice Republican system, we let the people rule, and by majority vote, they do things that are fundamentally unjust and contrary to the very purposes of establishing the Republic in the first place. This is where the critical difference that we mentioned in the opening lecture between a republic and a democracy comes into play. Publius has sometimes used these terms himself interchangeably, but here he says we have to make careful notice of the distinction. And here's how he explains the difference. He says, a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person. This can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. So here a democracy, as Publius understands it, is where the people govern directly. They're not governing through institutions. Think of Athenian-style democracy. They're assembling in person, all of the citizens are there, and the important decisions are made in that manner. So that's one form of self-government. The other form of self-government is a republic. And how does a republic differ from a democracy? Here's Publius. A republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking. The two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, first, the delegation of government in the latter to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. So a democracy is small, and the decisions are made by the citizens directly in person. A republic can be more extended, and it governs not with the direct participation of citizens, but through a representative institution, and the members of that institution are elected by the citizens. Those are the essential differences. And so the question we should ask is, well, why is one superior for solving the problem of faction over the other? Why is it that pure democracies seem to make faction worse? And why is it that republics might help to mitigate their effects? In order to understand this, let's try to consider the differences between a large group of people making a decision in person or making it through elected representatives where you have a separate institution that goes and does this. With the first option, Publius is worried about a kind of mob-like atmosphere. You have people who are meeting and deciding questions on the passions of the moment. And in a large assembly like that, it's pretty easy for the most kind of demagogic, the most clever leaders to get up and inflame the passions of the crowd. But what takes place in a representative institution, or at least what is supposed to take place in a representative institution? One of the things that takes place in a representative institution is what we call deliberation. Now, that has a couple different meanings. By deliberation, we mean you talk reasonably with your colleagues, you try to find common ground, and you, through the use of your reason and communication, hopefully come to some rational conclusion. But think of the root of that word, deliberation, deliberate. If we say someone is deliberate or something is deliberate, it means they're slow. It's something that takes time. And the core element of faction, remember, is passion. And for Publius, Time is the enemy of passion. Time is the thing that melts passion away. Our reason is much more long-lasting than the passions of the moment. And so what Publius wants to elicit in a representative institution is the reason of the people. You can think of a legislature, those of you who have a scientific background may be familiar with the concept of a centrifuge, where you put something into this device and it spins around very quickly, and the purpose of it is to separate the different elements out. What Publius has in mind here is that kind of effect. What the people bring to the table are their whole persons, their reasons and their passions bound together. It's very difficult to extricate one from the other. They're just bound up in us. That's what the institution does. That's what a representative institution does. It's designed to help the people filter out the passionate element, the base element, and to have rise to the top the cream, the thing that you want to govern. Remember, consent of the governed doesn't mean consent of both the passions and the reason. What Publius wants is the consent of the rational sense of the public, their best sense. And so a representative institution, the phrase that Publius uses is it's there to refine the public views. Not to change them, not to impose some other person's views in their place, but to elicit the best of the public itself. Let's read what he says. And in my view, this is one of the most beautifully written passages in the Federalist. He says, the effect of the first difference, and there he means the difference between a republic and a democracy. The effect of the first difference is, on the one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice, pronounced by the representatives of the people, will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves convened for the purpose. Such a wonderfully expressed, concise sentiment of how a representative institution is supposed to work. It's the public voice that still governs. This is a Republican government. It's not an aristocracy where only the wisest rule. So it's the people's voice. But the people's voice is much more likely to be rational. It's much more likely to be just. It's much more likely to be consistent with their long-term good if that voice is announced not by the people themselves, but by the institution. So the voice is different going in than it is coming out. Now, remember what we said about the anti-federalists and their view of representation. Remember what their standard was? That the representative process was only a necessary evil, that you really should have direct governance by the people, but if for logistical reasons you had to have a representative institution, that institution should seek to yield the exact same thing that the people themselves would have done if they could have all been assembled. Well, that's obviously not Madison's view. The whole point of the representative process for him is that what comes out of it is better, higher, more rational, more just than what goes into it. And so the two sides have a very, very different view of what the representative process is. And for Madison, that is a critical difference between the pure democracies of the classical world and this republic that he believes is represented by the Constitution. What's the other major difference between a republic and democracy? Well, the size. Because you have representative institutions in a republic, you actually can have a more extensive territory. You don't need to worry about getting everybody in the same place. One of the reasons why the extended territory is even possible in a republic. Why would you want a more extended territory, however? The anti-federalists say republics need to have people who are all like one another, who have the same basic view of the way of life, and so they can govern themselves in accord with that commonly held view. Well, if what you want out of the representative process is to have the passionate things, the self-interested things, fall by the wayside. And only the rational things, the people's best common sense to emerge. Think about the differences in size. In a small republic, there's not likely to be a lot of difference. You're not likely to get a lot of checking and balancing. You're not likely to have one opinion being checked or questioned by another one. Yet Publius says in an extended republic, there are more diverse interests. People are more likely to have different views. And in order to carry the day in a majority, a view is going to have to transcend a lot of these narrow interests. It's going to have to overcome the fact that there are lots of different people involved in this process. And won't that make it more likely that the bad ideas, the passionate ideas, the factious, self-interested ideas, that those are going to fall by the wayside, those are going to get checked, and only the very best ideas will arise out of this process. This is why Publius believes that a republic, with its extended size and with deliberation that takes place through institutions, is much more likely to allow the majority to govern, but to govern in a rational way. Now, there's one other interesting part of this. We've said that one of the benefits of having an extended territory is the diversity of interests that you're bringing in, and that this diversity of interest is really useful for making sure that, all sides are considered and not just one narrow interest gets to hold sway. Now, how do you get that diversity of interests? Publius has a very interesting passage in Federalist 10 on that question. He says, the diversity in the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate is not less an insuperable obstacle to a uniformity of interests. So what's he saying there? We want a diverse populace. Well, we're going to get that from human nature. That's how God made us. That's how we're wired. Remember, that's why we couldn't eliminate faction altogether. We're just naturally different from one another. Now, Madison says that natural difference, the fact that we're all made different, leads to other diversities. Notice how he puts it. He refers to a diversity in the faculties of men. In other words, men are of diverse abilities. Some are smarter than others. Some are stronger than others. Some are faster than others. Some are more industrious than others. These are natural differences. And these natural differences among human beings lead, he says, to the fact that they will come to acquire different amounts of wealth, different amounts and kinds of property. One might think in an egalitarian society that an object of government would be to even out these differences. By nature, we have different abilities. This leads to different amounts of wealth and property. And so we might think in a kind of egalitarian mindset, the role of the government is to come in and smooth out those differences. That's not what Madison says. Note what he says. He talks about the diversity in the faculties of men, and he says, the protection of these faculties is the first object of government. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. In other words, it's not a kind of sort of important object of government way down there on the list somewhere in the middle. It's the first object. So when we're trying to understand a text and we see a phrase like that, right, our ears need to perk up. It's the first object of government to protect the fact that because we're all different, this results in different amounts of wealth and property and different amounts of interest that we have. And the point of government isn't to even us all out. The point of government is to let those natural differences have their natural consequence. A very important lesson. And the reason it's brought up here is because this diversity among us is the very thing, Madison says, that also helps to mitigate the problem of faction. There are lots of different interests out there. And these interests compete against one another, and they check one another so that no one interest gains the upper hand, and only things that hopefully are most reflective of interests that are common to many orders of society can sort of rise to the top and affect public policy. We're going to talk more in the next session about the effects of these differences in human nature. But for now, we should turn to the conclusion of the 10th Federalist paper, because in having laid out the way in which a republic can help to mitigate or to control the effects of faction, and the way in which a republic does that in a way that democracy cannot, Madison comes back around to the very purpose of the new Constitution, which he had mentioned back in Federalist number 9. This is what he says. In the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government. A Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government. So if we recall the way Hamilton had put it in number 9, where Hamilton talks about wanting to retain the excellencies of Republican government and to lessen or to avoid its imperfections. And so here comes Madison reinforcing that idea. He's reinforced it by showing how the Constitution is going to contend with the problem of majority faction, and he does that on the basis of a certain understanding of human nature. And it's that question of human nature which we will turn more direct attention to in the next session.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. If you want to continue learning, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There, you will find over 40 free online courses including Ancient Christianity, the Genesis story, classic children's literature, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that what you'll learn will enrich your life and that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.